The biggest mistakes are almost always made by people who never imagined someone is quietly watching. That thought crossed my mind the instant I heard the heavy steel gate at the entrance of my farm groan open before sunrise, followed by the slow crunch of expensive tires rolling across my gravel driveway, without so much as a knock or a phone call. The cool Texas morning still carried the scent of fresh hay, damp earth, and cedar drifting through the pasture, while a thin layer of dew shimmered across the grass. My horses barely lifted their heads from their feed, more interested in breakfast than the strangers approaching my barn. I rested the grain bucket against the fence and watched a spotless white sport utility vehicle stop in front of my equipment shed as though it belonged there. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a woman dressed in a perfectly pressed white blazer, polished boots that had clearly never touched real farm mud, and dark sunglasses that reflected the rising sun. She carried a leather clipboard under one arm with the confidence of someone who had spent years believing paperwork could replace permission. Two members of the Homeowners Association board climbed out behind her along with a maintenance contractor carrying a professional camera, a measuring wheel, and a folder thick enough to hold an entire afternoon's worth of complaints. None of them hesitated at the property line. None of them asked if they could come in. They simply walked through the open gate and spread across my land as if they had already decided every acre belonged to them. The woman looked directly at me before speaking in the calm, rehearsed voice of someone accustomed to giving orders instead of introducing herself. "Routine compliance inspection," she announced. "We have received concerns regarding this property, and we will need to document everything." I glanced across my farm without answering immediately. The old red barn my grandfather built decades earlier stood exactly where it always had. The weathered fence stretched across rolling pasture that had been in my family long before the subdivision beyond the county road even existed. A light breeze rattled the metal roof above my workshop while the smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with diesel from the tractor I had serviced the night before. Nothing about the morning felt unusual except the people standing in front of me pretending this place belonged to their authority. I simply nodded once and stepped aside without arguing. That seemed to surprise the woman for only a second before she turned toward her group and casually waved them forward. Camera shutters immediately began clicking. One board member rolled the measuring wheel along my gravel driveway while another pointed toward my livestock barn and scribbled notes across a printed inspection form. The contractor photographed fence posts, gates, storage buildings, and even the county survey marker near the eastern pasture without asking a single question. The woman never once looked back to see whether I approved because she assumed silence meant agreement. She had no idea that every footstep across my property, every instruction she gave, every photograph she ordered, and every confident assumption she made was quietly becoming part of a much larger story. She believed she had arrived to inspect the farm of an ordinary man wearing worn work boots and an old denim jacket. What she could not possibly know was that she had just crossed the first line in a case that had been waiting patiently for someone exactly like her to finish writing the final chapter. Most people think they can recognize power by the clothes someone wears, but out here the only thing that really matters is what survives the next season. I stood quietly beside the fence while the visitors continued spreading across my farm, watching them move with the certainty of people who believe they already knew everything they needed to know. The morning sunlight slowly pushed away the last traces of fog resting over the pasture, and the familiar smell of fresh hay mixed with cedar and damp soil filled the cool air. My horses wandered toward the far side of the field, completely ignoring the strangers measuring fences and taking photographs. They had seen feed deliveries, veterinarians, and county inspectors before. To them, another group of people walking across the property meant absolutely nothing. My name is Marcus Bennett, and my family has worked this land for 3 generations. My grandfather bought the original 80 acres after returning home from military service with little more than determination and an aging tractor. My father spent decades repairing fences, planting trees, and expanding the pastures one careful purchase at a time until the farm became everything our family needed. I grew up learning how to repair equipment before I ever learned how to drive on a highway. Every fence post carried a memory. Every weathered board on the old barn reminded me of someone who had worked there long before I did. People driving past usually saw an ordinary ranch owned by an ordinary farmer, and I never gave them a reason to believe anything else. That quiet reputation protected far more than privacy. It protected my work. Around town, neighbors believed I occasionally handled consulting projects for the federal government, and that simple explanation usually ended every conversation before anyone became curious enough to ask another question. The truth was that my profession depended on patience, observation, and knowing exactly when silence accomplished more than conversation. Real investigations are rarely solved by dramatic speeches. They are solved by details that most people never notice. That was why, months earlier, I had upgraded the entire security system across the property after several unrelated trespassing incidents near neighboring farms. Small cameras rested beneath the roofline of the barn, overlooking the driveway, the workshop, the livestock area, and the eastern fence where the official county survey marker stood. Each camera automatically synchronized precise timestamps, audio, and video without requiring anyone to activate a recording. They quietly documented ordinary mornings filled with livestock, tractors, and passing storms. Today they were documenting something entirely different. Rebecca Sterling never glanced toward a single camera. She remained focused on directing her board members from one location to another, believing every note written onto her clipboard. Strengthened her position. She pointed toward my workshop, instructed the contractor to capture additional photographs, and asked another volunteer to measure the distance between the gravel driveway and the equipment shed. Nobody stopped to confirm whether the property actually belonged within the authority they claimed to represent. Nobody asked to review county records. Confidence had replaced verification long before they reached my gate. I folded my arms against the weathered fence and simply watched another ordinary Texas morning unfold because experience had taught me one lesson that never changes. People reveal the most about themselves when they believe nobody is paying close attention, and every decision Rebecca made was quietly becoming another piece of a story she had absolutely no idea she was helping to complete. Rebecca Sterling carried herself with the kind of confidence that only grows after years of hearing nobody say the word no. She moved across my farm as though every fence, every pasture, and every building already belonged under her authority. The polished clipboard tucked beneath her arm seemed less like office supplies and more like a symbol of personal power. Every few steps, she stopped to point at another part of my property while one board member wrote notes, another measured distances, and the contractor raised his camera to capture another photograph. She never once asked whether any of those places actually fell within the legal boundaries of the homeowners association. She simply assumed they did because nobody around her appeared willing to question the decision. Over the years, I had heard plenty of stories about Rebecca from people living inside Willow Creek estates. Families received warning letters because their garbage cans remained visible for an extra day after collection. Retired couples were fined because flower beds did not match approved landscaping guidelines. One neighbor spent weeks arguing over the color of a replacement mailbox after a storm damaged the original. Most residents eventually stopped fighting because hiring an attorney cost more than paying the fine. Rebecca had become accustomed to winning long before any disagreement reached the point of evidence. That confidence shaped every decision she made that morning. She pointed toward my eastern pasture where the official county survey marker stood only a few feet from the fence line. Instead of recognizing it as a legally recorded boundary, she instructed one volunteer to photograph it while another marked its location on the inspection form. The contractor quietly asked whether they should compare their measurements with county property records before making conclusions. Rebecca barely looked up from her paperwork. "Document everything first," she replied. "We will sort out the details afterward." That single sentence explained more about her leadership than anything else she had said all morning. She believed conclusions came before verification. Real investigations work the opposite way. Facts come first. Evidence comes second. Conclusions come last. As she continued walking toward my equipment barn, I noticed something else. Her attention lingered beyond the buildings and livestock. She studied the open pasture stretching toward the county road, following the tree line with slow, deliberate movements before looking back toward the subdivision entrance in the distance. It looked less like someone performing an inspection and more like someone imagining where future neighborhood expansion might someday reach. My family had declined multiple offers over the years to sell portions of this land, and those decisions had never been popular with certain developers. Rebecca probably never knew that history, Yet she behaved as though ownership itself could become negotiable if enough paperwork appeared on a clipboard. The warm breeze carried the scent of cedar and dry grass through the pasture, while a red-tailed hawk drifted high above the fields without a sound. Beneath the roofline of my barn, the small security cameras continued recording every conversation, every instruction, and every unnecessary step across the property. Rebecca never glanced upward. She remained focused on directing her team with complete certainty, believing she was building a case against an ordinary farmer. What she did not realize was that every confident instruction she gave, every unsupported assumption she repeated, and every decision she made without verification quietly strengthened a completely different case, one that had already begun long before she ever drove through my gate. Rebecca did not slow down for a single moment. If anything, the longer she stayed on my property, the more convinced she became that every decision she made carried unquestionable authority. She stopped outside my equipment barn, tapped her clipboard with a polished pen, and instructed the contractor to photograph the building from every angle. The shutter clicked again and again while another board member stretched a measuring tape along the side of the structure as though numbers alone could rewrite county records. I remained exactly where I had been, leaning lightly against the weathered fence while the morning breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut grass and warm cedar across the pasture. My tractor sat beside the barn exactly where I had parked it the previous evening after servicing the engine. A stack of square hay bales rested under the open shelter, and a ranch dog wandered lazily through the shade before settling beneath an old oak tree. Everything looked exactly as it had for years, yet Rebecca studied every corner with the determination of someone searching for a violation she had already decided existed. She pointed toward a gravel lane leading behind the barn and announced that the access road appeared to extend beyond what she believed should be the approved property line. Without checking a survey map or requesting county documentation, she instructed another volunteer to record it as a possible encroachment. The contractor hesitated for only a second before quietly asking whether they should verify the legal boundary first. Rebecca answered without looking up from her notes. "We are documenting conditions. Verification comes later." Once again, assumptions arrived before facts. I watched one board member walk directly past a clearly visible county survey monument set in concrete near the eastern fence. The official brass marker reflected the sunlight, impossible to miss, yet nobody stopped to read the identification number stamped into its surface. Instead, they photographed it from several angles before marking it as another item requiring review. Every camera flash captured not only the marker itself, but also the position of the people standing around it. Every timestamp quietly matched the recordings already stored by my security system. Rebecca then walked toward my workshop and looked through the open doorway without asking permission. Shelves lined with tools, neatly labeled storage bins, maintenance records, and farming equipment filled the building. She instructed the contractor to take additional photographs inside, while another volunteer copied serial numbers from several pieces of equipment onto the inspection form. I said nothing. There was no reason to interrupt people who believed they were strengthening their own position when they were actually documenting every unnecessary step they chose to take. A pair of county property maps rested inside a weatherproof cabinet mounted beside the workshop entrance, available for anyone who genuinely wanted accurate information. None of them opened it. They preferred confidence over confirmation because confidence felt faster. The sun climbed higher, warming the gravel beneath our boots, while distant cattle grazed quietly beyond the fence, as though the entire morning were perfectly ordinary. Rebecca finally looked toward me with a satisfied smile that suggested she believed the inspection was producing exactly the results she expected. She had no idea that every photograph, every handwritten note, every unsupported conclusion, and every unnecessary instruction was fitting together with remarkable precision, creating a record far more complete than the one she imagined. And by the time she realized which investigation those records actually belonged to, every missing piece would already be in place. By then, the inspection had stopped looking like an ordinary visit and started feeling like a carefully staged performance where everyone except the audience believed they already knew the ending. Rebecca continued directing her board members with complete confidence, checking boxes on her clipboard, faster than anyone could possibly verify the facts behind them. She instructed one volunteer to document the distance between my workshop and the county road, while another photographed the livestock fence from several different angles. The contractor quietly followed every instruction, although I noticed him glancing more than once toward the county survey marker they had ignored earlier. He seemed uncomfortable, but he continued doing his job because he had been hired to record what he was told, not to challenge the person giving orders. I remained calm beside the fence, occasionally feeding another scoop of grain to the horses while the morning settled into its familiar rhythm. The wind carried the smell of warm pine, dry grass, and fresh coffee drifting from my kitchen window. Somewhere beyond the western pasture, a tractor engine echoed across neighboring farmland before fading back into the quiet. Rebecca probably interpreted my silence as surrender. That assumption was understandable because most people expect resistance when they overstep their authority. When they do not receive it, they often mistake patience for weakness. Years of investigative work had taught me exactly the opposite. The more someone believes they are completely in control, the more openly they reveal their own decision-making. Interrupting them too early only prevents the truth from unfolding naturally. Every security camera beneath the barn roof continued recording synchronized video with precise timestamps. The driveway camera captured every vehicle entering the property. The workshop camera documented who crossed the doorway and when. The eastern pasture camera overlooked the survey monument, the fence line, and every measurement being taken nearby. Even the audio system quietly preserved every instruction Rebecca gave to her team. None of the equipment was hidden particularly well because it had never been intended to trap visitors. It existed to protect livestock, machinery, and property after previous incidents involving trespassers in the surrounding area. Today it happened to be preserving something far more valuable than security footage. Rebecca eventually walked back toward me carrying several completed inspection forms. She asked for my full name, claiming it was needed to finalize potential compliance notices. I answered politely without volunteering anything more. She wrote Marcus Bennett across the top page without recognizing it. There was no flicker of familiarity, no hesitation, and no indication that the name meant anything beyond another property owner she believed she could manage through regulations. She thanked me with a professional smile that never reached her eyes before turning back toward the others. "We have enough," she said confidently. "Let us finish documenting the remaining structures." I watched the group spread out one last time across the farm, listening to the steady clicking of the camera shutter, the scratching of pens across paper, and the crunch of boots on gravel. Every sound blended into the peaceful morning as though this were simply another ordinary day on the ranch. In reality, every minute that passed strengthened a timeline that could no longer be disputed. They believed they were collecting evidence against me, but evidence does not choose sides. It simply preserves the truth, and by allowing Rebecca to continue exactly as she wished, I knew she was quietly building the most complete record of her own decisions anyone could have asked for. Rebecca gathered the completed inspection forms with an expression that suggested the morning had unfolded exactly as she expected. She glanced across the pasture one last time before walking toward me with measured confidence, the gravel crunching beneath her polished boots while the warm Texas sun climbed higher above the oak trees. The contractor lowered his camera, and the other board members stood nearby comparing handwritten notes, satisfied that they had documented enough to justify whatever letter they planned to mail later. Rebecca stopped a few feet away and held the clipboard against her side. "You will be receiving formal notice regarding several compliance concerns," she said in a calm, professional tone. "If necessary, additional enforcement action may follow." I looked at the papers in her hand before meeting her eyes for the first time since she arrived. "Before you leave," I said quietly, "there is one thing you should know." She folded her arms with the faint smile of someone expecting another property owner to argue about regulations. Instead, I reached into the inside pocket of my work jacket and removed a leather credential wallet that had remained there all morning. I opened it just long enough for the identification to be clearly visible. My name, my photograph, my federal credentials. The gold badge reflected a brief flash of sunlight before I closed the wallet again. For the first time since driving through my gate, Rebecca hesitated. The silence lasted only a moment before she gave a short laugh that sounded more dismissive than surprised. "Anyone can buy something that looks official," she replied. That changes absolutely nothing about this inspection. One of the board members shifted uneasily, glancing from me to Rebecca, but nobody spoke. I simply nodded once because her response was exactly what I expected. Real authority never depends on convincing someone during an argument. It simply continues following established procedure. I slipped the credential wallet back into my jacket without another word and reached for the cell phone resting on the fence beside me. The screen was already unlocked. I selected a single contact and placed the call. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. I confirmed my location, gave a brief status update, listened quietly, and answered with only one sentence. Everything has now been documented. I ended the call and returned the phone to my pocket. Rebecca watched the entire exchange with visible impatience. "Was that supposed to impress us?" she asked. "We are almost finished here." I smiled politely. "No," I answered. "It was simply the final notification that this morning has reached the point we were waiting for." She frowned slightly, clearly unsure what I meant, but she dismissed the comment almost immediately. She turned back toward her board members and instructed them to organize the inspection paperwork before leaving the property. None of them realized that my phone call had not started anything new. It had merely confirmed that the final pieces of an existing timeline were now complete. The security cameras had captured every arrival, every instruction, every measurement, every photograph, and every unsupported conclusion with synchronized timestamps. Their own inspection forms contained names, times, and observations that matched those recordings minute by minute. The quiet breeze continued moving through the pasture while my horses grazed peacefully beyond the fence, completely unaware that the ordinary morning everyone believed was ending had actually just reached the moment where the real investigation was finally ready to step into the open. Less than 10 minutes after I ended the call, I heard another set of vehicles approaching from the county road. Unlike Rebecca's arrival earlier that morning, these trucks slowed before reaching the gate and remained outside until someone stepped forward to identify themselves. The contrast could not have been clearer. One pickup carried the markings of the County Land Records Office. Another belonged to the County Sheriff's Administrative Division. Behind them was an unmarked government vehicle that blended in so well most people would have overlooked it completely. Rebecca watched through narrowed eyes, still holding her clipboard with the same confidence she had carried all morning. Although I noticed the first hint of uncertainty when nobody inside the arriving vehicles acknowledged her presence before speaking to me. A county survey supervisor walked through the gate carrying a weatherproof case filled with official plats, certified boundary maps, and surveying equipment. He greeted me by name before introducing himself to everyone else. Moments later, 2 federal investigators stepped out of the unmarked vehicle. They did not arrive with urgency or dramatic announcements. They carried notebooks, document cases, and calm expressions that reflected years of following procedure instead of emotion. One of them shook my hand and quietly asked, "Has everything been documented?" I answered with a simple nod. "Every minute." Rebecca immediately stepped forward and began explaining that her homeowners association had been conducting a routine compliance inspection. She spoke with confidence, describing possible violations, property concerns, and her authority as president of the association. The senior investigator listened politely without interrupting, occasionally making brief notes. When she finished, he thanked her and asked one simple question. "Did anyone verify county jurisdiction before entering this property?" The silence that followed lasted noticeably longer than any conversation earlier that morning. Rebecca glanced toward her board members, then toward the contractor, apparently expecting someone else to answer. Nobody did. The county survey supervisor calmly opened one of the certified maps across the hood of his truck. Thick survey lines, parcel numbers, easements, and recorded boundaries filled the page. He pointed to my property, then to the neighboring subdivision, tracing the legal boundary with one finger. My farm sat entirely outside the homeowners association. It had never been annexed, never incorporated into the subdivision, and never fallen under its governing documents. Every official record confirmed exactly the same conclusion. Rebecca stared at the map without speaking. The investigator then removed another folder from his case. Inside were printed photographs, correspondence logs, copies of previous complaints, and documented communications collected over several months. He explained in a steady voice that concerns involving repeated assertions of authority beyond documented jurisdiction had already been under administrative review before that morning. My call had not launched an investigation. It had simply confirmed that the final observable events had now been independently documented in real time. Rebecca slowly lowered her clipboard. The confidence that had guided every decision since sunrise gave way to quiet disbelief as she looked from the official county records to the federal investigators and then toward the security cameras mounted beneath my barn roof. For the first time all morning, she seemed to understand that she had not interrupted an ordinary day on a quiet farm. Without realizing it, she had stepped directly into the closing chapter of a process that had been patiently waiting for verifiable evidence, and nearly every piece of that evidence had been created by her own decisions. No one raised their voice because the evidence no longer required anyone to argue. The county survey supervisor placed one certified map beside another across the hood of the truck, carefully aligning parcel numbers, recorded easements, and property boundaries until every line matched perfectly. He then compared those records with the measurements Rebecca's own team had taken only minutes earlier. Ironically, their notes confirmed the same boundary markers they had overlooked during the inspection. The contractor quietly admitted that he had suggested verifying the county records before drawing conclusions, and the investigators simply noted his statement without judgment. This was never about winning an argument. It was about establishing an accurate timeline supported by documents instead of assumptions. One federal investigator opened a secure laptop and synchronized the timestamps from my security cameras with the times written on the inspection forms Rebecca had completed throughout the morning. Every arrival, every instruction, every photograph, every measurement, and every movement across the property appeared in exact chronological order. The driveway camera showed the vehicles entering through the gate without requesting permission. The workshop camera documented who entered the building and when. The eastern pasture camera captured the survey marker that remained in plain sight, while unsupported conclusions were recorded only a few feet away. Even the audio recordings matched the written inspection notes, almost minute by minute. The investigator calmly explained that independently verified records become especially valuable when multiple sources confirm the same sequence of events without contradiction. Rebecca listened in complete silence. The confidence that had defined her presence since sunrise had gradually been replaced by careful attention as she realized the documents in front of her were telling a story that no personal opinion could rewrite. The county supervisor then produced copies of recorded property filings dating back decades. They showed every legal transfer of ownership, every officially surveyed boundary, and every recorded amendment affecting the surrounding subdivision. My farm had remained entirely separate from the homeowners association through every revision. Nothing in the governing documents granted authority over this land. Nothing suggested otherwise. The investigators also reviewed correspondence collected over previous months involving repeated questions about jurisdiction, including responses from county offices that consistently directed interested parties back to the publicly recorded property records. Those communications demonstrated that reliable information had always been available to anyone willing to verify it before acting. Rebecca slowly looked toward the clipboard she had carried so confidently all morning. The pages that had once represented certainty now reflected something entirely different. They documented decisions made before confirming basic facts. The contractor quietly placed his camera on the tailgate of the truck, while one investigator requested copies of every photograph taken that day, so the complete record would remain preserved alongside the official timeline. Nobody accused anyone. Nobody celebrated. Every person present simply continued following established procedure. That was the remarkable part. Justice did not arrive with dramatic speeches or emotional confrontations. It arrived through certified maps, recorded documents, synchronized timestamps, and patient verification. Standing beside the weathered fence where I had spent the entire morning, I looked across the same peaceful pasture filled with grazing horses and gently moving grass. The farm had never changed. The truth had never changed. Only the understanding of what had actually happened that morning was changing now. And because every important detail had been documented from beginning to end, the facts could finally speak for themselves with a clarity that no assumption could overcome. Several months passed before the farm felt exactly the way it had on the morning before Rebecca drove through my gate, and somehow that was the most satisfying part of the entire experience. The sunrise still painted the pastures with soft shades of gold. The smell of fresh hay still drifted through the cool Texas air before the afternoon heat settled across the fields. My horses still wandered toward the same fence every morning, expecting breakfast at nearly the same minute, and the old red barn still stood where my grandfather built it decades earlier. If someone had driven past the property without knowing the story, they would have seen nothing more than another peaceful family farm beginning another ordinary day. That was exactly how I wanted it. The legal reviews eventually concluded exactly where the evidence had pointed from the very beginning. County records confirmed the property boundaries once again. Administrative findings reflected the documented timeline created through certified maps, recorded filings, synchronized security footage, inspection notes, and witness statements. Procedures were updated, jurisdictional guidance was clarified, and future inspections involving neighboring properties were required to verify official records before any field activity could begin. The changes were quiet, practical, and based entirely on documented facts rather than emotion. I never celebrated because there was nothing to celebrate about proving something that had always been true. Truth does not become more valuable simply because other people finally recognize it. Rebecca and I never had another confrontation. The last time I saw her was during one of the administrative meetings where records were being reviewed. She looked different, not because of appearance, but because certainty had been replaced with caution. She listened far more than she spoke, and every question she asked began with a request to verify the facts before reaching a conclusion. I genuinely hoped she carried that lesson forward because communities work better when authority is exercised with humility instead of assumption. The contractor later stopped by the farm on his own time to return a copy of several photographs he had taken that morning. He admitted he had felt uneasy during the inspection, but believed it was not his place to challenge the instructions he had been given. We talked for a while beside the same workshop where everything had unfolded, and before leaving he looked across the pasture and smiled. "This place never changed," he said. "Only the story did." I thought about those words long after he drove away because they captured the entire experience better than anything else could have. The county survey markers still reflected the afternoon sunlight exactly where it always had. The cameras remained beneath the barn roof, quietly recording ordinary days filled with livestock, tractors, changing weather, and peaceful routines. The old steel gate still opened every morning and closed every evening with the same familiar sound. Every small detail that seemed ordinary at the beginning of the story had returned exactly where it belonged at the end. I realized that real authority had never been the badge resting inside my jacket or the title printed on an identification card. Real authority came from respecting the law enough to let evidence speak before opinions did. Justice had never needed raised voices, dramatic confrontations, or revenge. It only needed patience, accurate records, and the willingness to let the truth arrive in its own time. As I looked across the fields stretching toward the horizon, I smiled to myself, picked up another bucket of grain, and walked toward the horses because after everything that had happened, the farm was finally what it had always deserved to be, simply home.